Hi, everyone. Thanks for getting your week one work into me, your introduction videos, your posts in the AMA thread, and your responses to the field area spreadsheet. That stuff is going to be really helpful for me. We'll leave the AMA open. If you still have questions or if things come up throughout the semester that you want to clear up, by all means, drop them in the AMA. This week, we're going to be starting our exploration of one of our four major rhetorical concepts for the course, which is the rhetorical situation. We're going to do so via a reading by LLoy'd Bitzer called The Rhetorical Situation. You don't necessarily have to read this text. You can if you want, but I'm going to break it down for you in this video, and this is going to set the stage for the rest of the work and projects that we'll be doing throughout the semester by giving us just a good solid understanding of what rhetoric and composition is as a field, but also to kind of how to think rhetorically when we are asked to communicate in different academic or professional situations. So Bitzer's essay was originally published in the 1960s, but in order to understand kind of where Bitzer is coming from, we have to go back a lot further than that. So what is rhetorical theory to begin with? I think we should probably start with classical rhetoric, which goes all the way back to Aristotle. So we're talking now about 4th century BCE, the birth of democratic discourse. Aristotle wrote a text called Rhetoric, which basically just laid out the fundamentals of persuasive speech. Persuasive speech at the time was especially important because in ancient Greek democracy, you had this thing called the polis. The polis was a physical space where land-owning men could get together and they could discourse or talk about various issues that were affecting the state or the community. And whoever would discourse more persuasively on the matters in hand, it's likely their solution would be the one that was chosen to be enacted for the whole community. So Aristotle laid out basically three major criteria by which persuasive speech in the polis should be judged: ethos, pathos, and logos. Ethos being the speaker's credibility, pathos being their ability to elicit an emotional response from the audience, and finally, the logic of their appeal. So this ignited a centuries-long study into the art of persuasion. That's my field presently, rhetoric and composition. At least when I'm teaching these classes, that's my field, identification. Today, rhetoric and composition as a field, I think, studies more the pedagogy of writing, the teaching of writing, the learning of writing. How do we acquire different kinds of writing and communication skills? Bitzer thinks that we should start by looking at what makes rhetoric situational. Much of what this text is just a justification for the study of the term rhetorical situation. That's why I'm not going to have you read it. It's very much rooted in kind of establishing the internalized discourse of the field of rhetoric and composition. And I don't know how useful that is to us. However, I do think the concept can be useful in kind of structuring our responses to some of the different assignments that we're going to be called on to do throughout the semester. So Bitzer here really just kind of sets up the concept and sets up the discussion of why we should be talking about this concept, which is a really savvy academic move. And if we gain nothing else from the introduction, we can kind of get a cue from Bitzer of like, hey, this is the thing that people do in fields when there are terms and concepts that maybe remain submerged. We surface them and we try to shine a light on them and we try to figure out what can we gain from looking more into these concepts. That's what Bitzer is doing with the rhetorical situation here. And in doing so, he wound up revolutionizing the field. I think the key takeaway from this section is the idea that while rhetorical discourse always emerges from a rhetorical situation, rhetorical situations are not always met with rhetorical discourse. Some rhetorical situations kind of come and go without ever receiving any kind of a response. Bitzer compares this to the thing where, you have a good comeback in a conversation, but you don't think of it until the conversation is well over. The French refer to that as, and I may mispronounce this, the esprit de l'escalier, which is basically staircase wit. You've left a conversation, you're on the staircase walking away from that conversation, you're thinking, that would have been a great thing to say. So that's something to consider here, that there are rhetorical situations that happen and occur all the time that nobody ever responds to. But anytime that we are making a response in a rhetorical concept, it has emerged from a rhetorical situation. And so if we find ourselves making a response, it's worth thinking about what is the situation and the constituent elements of the situation that are calling on me to respond, so I can make sure that my response is best fitted to that situation. Bitzer also says here, the rhetoric alters reality by bringing into existence a discussion of such a character that the audience in thought and action is so engaged that it becomes a mediator of change. This is critically important. You'll see as we go on that a rhetorical audience must be able to enact some kind of change on the situation, the exigence that is called for the rhetoric to create the rhetoric. But also the idea that the language in one way or another shapes our perception of reality here is critical. We're not necessarily just trying to change people's opinions. We're trying to change how they interact with the real world around them through language. After laying out his baseline definition for what constitutes a rhetorical situation, Bitzer then goes into kind of giving us some criteria for identifying rhetorical discourse. He gives us these 7 points here, and of those I want to focus on 3 of them. So speech is given, this is number 2, speech is given rhetorical significance by the situation, not the other way around. You can't engineer a rhetorical situation through uninvited discourse. The situation has to invite the discourse first. A situation is rhetorical insofar as it needs and invites discourse capable of altering its reality. So the idea here is that we're not talking about imaginary things or thought experiments. If Congress were to call on scientists to make proposals to solve global warming, let's say climate change, then proposals that are dealing with things that are beyond the realm of our technical capability at this time would not really be rhetorical discourse in this situation, because they need to be able to alter the reality of the situation in one way or another. Bitzer also says the situation controls the rhetorical response, not the rhetor or their persuasive intent. So this means you kind of can't just hijack a rhetorical situation to sort of imbue your own kind of a bias or agenda onto that situation. The situation determines the discourse, not the other way around. In the next part of Bitzer's rhetorical situation, he lays out the basically the anatomy of a rhetorical situation. So he goes into the constituent parts of a rhetorical situation and what each part kind of does, what its function is, or how we use it. So he starts with exigence or exigency. It's a felt sense of urgency, the thing that's calling on us to respond, to say something. He calls it an imperfection marked by urgency. So it's the why of rhetorical discourse. So let's say you've got a dangerous intersection near your house, and there's kids playing in the street, and sometimes, cars make it dangerous for those kids, and you want to go to the town council and see if you can get a traffic light put in there. That's your exigency, your felt sense of danger, the idea that something needs to change, that aspect of reality, the situation that needs to change. From there, you have an audience, who are your mediators of change. That's what Bitzer calls them. These are people, remember, a rhetorical discourse has to be able to impact reality in one way or another, the reality of the rhetorical situation. And so for an audience to be rhetorical, they have to have power in one way or another. They have to be able to enact change on the situation, having heard your discourse on that situation. And then finally, we have to acknowledge any constraints of the situation. So constraints are, they could be people, they could be aspects of the situation that prevent whatever the message from getting across, or from people, prevent people from taking action on your message in one way or another. So maybe one of the constraints of the situation is that you feel the need is very urgent and there's not a town hall meeting for another 6 months. You've got to get that traffic light up, but they're not going to meet again for another 6 months. That's a constraint that you have to work under. And maybe that alters your rhetorical strategy then. Maybe you don't want to appear at a town hall meeting. Maybe then you want to write a letter to the editor of the local newspaper because you think that might get action taken faster in that case. So a rhetorical situation is made up of an exigency, which is calling on a rhetor, a speaker or writer, to make some kind of communication to influence a rhetorical audience, which is a mediator of change, to have some kind of effect on that exigency. And within that situation, there will be multiple constraints that the communicator has to take into consideration to make sure that their message is getting across as effective and efficiently as possible. And that's the rhetorical situation, at least as Bitzer lays it out in the rhetorical situation. How does this apply to us as people who are looking at writing in technical disciplines? That's an interesting thing to think about. Although I have seen examples of how students can turn their work in technical disciplines into some kind of activism, which obviously does often have us dealing with some kind of social issue or political problem or something thereof. I think there are other ways too, Documentation is persuasive. The other day, my wife and I bought a coffee table. The coffee table came with installation instructions, and we spent about 30 seconds looking at the installation instructions before we said, we're just going to figure this out on our own, because the instructions were awful and unhelpful and not good and not very persuasive for us as people who bought this piece of furniture in communicating the idea of like, hey, this is what you should use in order to put this thing together. So that's obviously like a very simplified example, but anytime that we're kind of presenting discourse out into the world, we're creating some kind of an argument, right? It doesn't necessarily matter what kind of discourse it is. There's argument sort of embedded in it, in that somebody was called to create that discourse for a particular reason, and that person has said, hey, this is the discourse for the moment. And you as technical writers will certainly be called on throughout your career to create the discourse of the moment for many various problems and situations. So we'll do some of that in this class. We'll exemplify the role that rhetorical situation can play, or at least the role that rhetorical discourse can play, and acknowledging rhetorical situation can play in creating technical discourse. But it's also an interesting question, I think, for us to think about throughout the course of the semester. How is a technical discourse persuasive, and what does it mean to be a persuasive technical communicator? Bitzer has given us a little bit of a start here. From here, we'll jump into genre theory, and we'll start to think about how to make decisions about what we make in different communication situations based on the aspects of the rhetorical situation that are calling on us to respond.